This recording is an excerpt of Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies, Teaching and Learning for Justice in a Changing World, Paris and Elaine. Chapter 1. What is culturally sustaining pedagogy and why does it matter? Across the centuries, countless philosophers and teachers, and legions of students, have asked that age-old educational question: what is the purpose of schooling? In the context of the United States and other nation-states living out legacies of genocide, land theft, enslavement, and various forms of colonialism, the answer to this question for communities of color has been rather clear. The purpose of state-sanctioned schooling has been to forward the largely assimilationist and often violent white imperial project, with students and families being asked to lose or deny their languages, literacies, cultures, and histories in order to achieve in schools. In the United States and beyond, this saga of cultural and linguistic assault has had and continues to have devastating effects on the access, achievement, and well-being of students of color in public schools. Continued social and educational inequality, coupled with massive demographic changes sweeping the United States and Europe, among other regions, have brought to the fore an urgent, more pressing iteration of this age-old question: what is the purpose of school in pluralistic societies? This has been the most important question for us over the past several years as we have worked to offer a needed change in stance and terminology in pedagogical theory and practice, culturally sustaining pedagogy. CSP seeks to perpetuate and foster, to sustain, linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as part of schooling for positive social transformation. CSP positions dynamic cultural dexterity as a necessary good and sees the outcome of learning as additive rather than subtractive, as remaining whole rather than framed as broken, as critically enriching strengths rather than replacing deficits. Culturally sustaining pedagogy exists wherever education sustains the lifeways of communities who have been and continue to be damaged and erased through schooling. The more we write and think about CSP, the more we are convinced that we are dealing with fundamental questions about teaching and learning. At the same time, our theorizing has taken us far beyond the traditional kinds of questions that are commonly asked in much of education research, questions that too often obscure, confound, or remain silent on issues of systemic racial and intersectional inequalities that continue to be part of the fabric of schooling. In essence, by proposing schooling as a site for sustaining the cultural ways of being of communities of color, rather than eradicating them, CSP is responding to the many ways that schools continue to function as part of the colonial project. We seek to disrupt the pervasive anti-indigeneity, anti-blackness, and related anti-brownness, from anti-Latinidad to Islamophobia, and model minority myths so foundational to schooling in the United States and many other colonial nation states. In our work with CSP, we begin matter-of-factly with the knowledge that our languages, literacies, histories, cultural ways of being as people, and communities of color are not pathological. Beginning with this understanding, an understanding fought for across the centuries, allows us to see the fallacy of measuring ourselves and the young people in our communities solely against white middle-class norms of knowing and being that continue to dominate notions of educational achievement. Du Bois, 1965, of course, theorized this well over a century ago with his conceptualization of double consciousness. This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. In this work, we are committed to envisioning and enacting pedagogies that are not filtered through the glass of amused contempt and pity, for example, the achievement gap, but rather are centered on contending in complex ways with the rich and innovative linguistic, literate, and cultural practices of Indigenous, Black, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, and other youth and communities of color. In our conceptualization of CSP, we have moved away from, sometimes even progressive pedagogies that are too closely aligned with linguistic, literate, and cultural hegemony. Instead, we have worked with others to develop a pedagogical agenda that does not concern itself with the seemingly panoptic white gaze, Morrison, 1998, that permeates educational research and practice with and for students of color, their teachers, and their schools. In a 1998 interview, Nobel laureate Toni Morrison responded to misguided critiques of her books with the rebuttal, "As though our lives have no meaning and no depth without the white gaze. And I have spent my entire writing life trying to make sure that the white gaze was not the dominant one in any of my books." As we think about teaching and teachers, we ask, what would our pedagogies look like if this gaze and the kindred patriarchal, cis heteronormative, English monolingual, ableist, classist, xenophobic, Judeo-Christian gazes weren't the dominant one? What would liberating ourselves from this gaze and the educational expectations it forwards mean for our abilities to envision new and recover community-rooted forms of teaching and learning? What if the goal of teaching and learning with youth of color was not ultimately to see how closely students could perform white middle-class norms, but rather was to explore, honor, extend, and at times problematize their cultural practices and investments? We ask this question knowing that so-called educational integration has always framed success in terms of unidirectional assimilation into whiteness. For example, as a result of Brown v. Board of Education, they weren't busing white students into black neighborhoods and firing white teachers. See Walker, 2013. For Morrison, as soon as she jettisoned this white gaze, she found herself in a new territory that allowed for boundless creativity, a world of imagination and possibility. This was brand new space, she said, and once I got there, it was like the whole world opened up and I was never going to give that up. What kinds of transformative experiences can we offer our students such that a whole world of learning opens up for them, one that, like Morrison, they would never want to give up, versus one that continually gives up on them? What can educators of color and other educators in solidarity with us learn from Morrison's courage and conviction to decenter whiteness, to envision a world where we owed no explanations to white people about the value of our children's culture, language, and learning potential? It is important to note that in decentering whiteness, we are not putting aside issues of so-called access and equity. We are reframing them. For too long, scholarship on access and equity has centered implicitly or explicitly around the white gaze-centered question. How can we get these working-class kids of color to speak, write, be more like middle-class white ones, rather than critiquing the white gaze itself that sees, hears, and frames students of color in every which way as marginal and deficient? For equally long, as Fairclough and Rosa and Flores have pointed out, much of additive scholarship has focused on the cultural and linguistic practices of our students rather than the listening and framing practices of white stream institutions. We believe that equity and access can best be achieved by centering the dynamic practices and selves of students and communities of color in a critical, additive, and expansive vision of schooling. Instead of being oppressive, homogenizing forces, CSP asks us to reimagine schools as sites where diverse, heterogeneous practices are not only valued but sustained. In fundamentally reimagining the purpose of education, CSP demands a critical, emancipatory vision of schools that reframes the object of critique from our children to oppressive systems. Reflecting forward, where we are and where we need to go. CSP must extend the previous visions of asset pedagogies by demanding explicitly pluralistic outcomes that are not centered on white middle-class, monolingual, monocultural norms and notions of educational achievement, and that call out the imposition of these norms as harmful to and discriminatory against many of our communities. CSP must also resist static, unidirectional notions of culture and race that center only on long-standing cultural practices of communities without also attending to continual shifts and cultural reworkings. Finally, CSP must be willing to seriously contend with the sometimes problematic aspects of our communities, even as we celebrate our progressive, social justice-oriented movements and approaches. We are in many ways at the asset-based critical pedagogical edge. For us, as we hope is clear by now, we are not interested in offering pedagogical quick fixes or best practices that teachers can drop into the same old tired curriculum that deadens the souls of vast numbers of children of color in U.S. schools. Nor are we, as we wrote earlier in this chapter, interested in asking questions that fall neatly within the bounds of conventional educational research and practice. As such, this volume is a product of a collective of researchers and teachers who share the explicit purpose of thinking through the implications of CSP, pushing its theoretical boundaries, growing its practice through case study and critique, and bringing theory and practice together to offer a way forward towards teaching our goal of developing a more pluralistic and just future. As part of this collective effort, we organize a retreat in Half Moon Bay, California, in order to flesh out and think through the challenges and potential of CSP in times of radically changing demographics, ongoing justice movements, and severe political and social backlash. Out of that retreat, we took on the name Half Moon Bay Crew, connotating the love and respect we developed prior to, during, and since our intensive retreat. In reflecting forward on the present and future of CSP, we think it's necessary to once again ask the question, what are we seeking to sustain through CSP? The simple, perhaps taken for granted assumption behind the development of CSP is, we sustain what we love. To remix Lanson Billings' oft-heard assertion, we teach what we love. CSP calls for sustaining and revitalizing that which has over centuries sustained us, as communities of color struggling to make it, to resist, revitalize, and reimagine under enduring colonial conditions that constantly work to diminish our intellectual capacities, cultures, languages, and yes, our very lives. As we mention love and lives here, we hold up the work of Black, queer, and trans women and all who have forwarded Black Lives Matter, Garza 2014. This movement for Black lives and distinct coalitional intersectional justice work in Native, most especially in this moment, the Indigenous sovereignty, land, and water protectors at Standing Rock, Latinx, Asian and Pacific Islander, and LGBTQ communities, in many ways led by young people, is calling out systemic racism across institutions, including schools. And it has transformed our thinking about the need for CSP as being literally about sustaining our minds and bodies as communities of color within a schooling system that has often had the exact opposite goals. At the end of the day, the term culturally sustaining pedagogy is only as important as the ideas behind it and the enactments it engenders. Our collective knows well that naming matters, that terms like culturally relevant pedagogy, cultural modeling, third space, and funds of knowledge remain lasting concepts. After all, folks in this volume coined these terms and concepts. But, as Chris Gutierrez, chapter 14 this volume, has said in our meetings, we also know that bad things happen to good ideas. Yet it is the decades of educational justice work done through these terms, these concepts, that matters the most. And we are hopeful that CSP can join in such justice work at a time when we must be ever more explicit about critiquing the oppressive systems that limit our life experiences and centering our cultural communities in teaching and learning. We believe that a critical centering of the valued ways of youth and communities of color in education is a radical act, an act made possible by the work of many in our collective and across the centuries of struggles in our communities, an act that disrupts a schooling system centered on ideologies of white, middle-class, monolingual, cis-heteropatriarchal, able-bodied superiority. In this book, we focus on and examine educational spaces that instead center cultural, linguistic, and literate pluralism as part of schooling for racial justice and positive social transformation. We believe that CSP, like all critical asset-based approaches, is at heart about survival, a survival we want to sustain through education, and about changing the conditions under which we live and work by opening up new and revitalizing community-rooted ways of thinking about education beyond, as Morrison reminds us, the white gaze. We want to create conditions where children of color can both survive and thrive. Toward this effort, we agree wholeheartedly with Carol Lee, who shares in her chapter in this volume. If particular cultural practices and belief systems allowed people of African descent in the U.S. and the diaspora to survive and thrive through enslavement and Jim Crow, America's 2 centuries of legal apartheid, then it seems reasonable that sustaining these practices and strategic transformations in response to changing conditions is a worthwhile goal. The gravity of this statement and this work writ large is laid to bear starkly and beautifully by Lee and provokes further critical questions. Under the latest iterations of white supremacist, capitalist, cis-heteropatriarchal ideologies, systems, and practices, What knowledges must we sustain in order to overcome and survive when faced with a power that seeks to sustain itself above and beyond, and sometimes shot through our bodies? CSP is indeed about providing our children with the opportunities to survive and thrive, but it is also centrally about love, a love that can help us see our young people as whole versus broken when they enter schools, and a love that can work to keep them whole as they grow and expand who they are and can be through education.